the 18th Amendment, passed by Congress December 18th, 1917, ratified January 16, 1919, repealed by Amendment 21. After 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within, the importation thereof into, or the exportation thereof from the United States and all territories subject to the jurisdiction thereof for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited. So a fun fact about this is that a lot of the people who were campaigning for prohibition didn't realize exactly how broad it was going to be.
They thought it would be like this the strong drink or something.
Yeah, they thought it was just going to be like liquor, like distilled alcohol. And then when it included wine, a lot of people were like, wait, what? Wine and beer, they were like, well, that's not a big deal. And yeah, for some people it is. Now, I myself, let's be very clear about this, I'm a non-drinker. Have been my whole life. There are a lot of good reasons I don't drink alcohol.
Yeah, I'm I won't say not a non-drinker, but I like maybe like once a year at maybe twice a year at the most. A thing.
Yeah.
Like even when I did in my youth, I only ever drunk one thing that's like barely a month at a time. So yeah, I've never been a heavy drinker anyways.
Yeah. So I do not in general shame people for a little casual drinking. Like, I have an uncle who, when I was a kid, his name, as far as my sisters and I were concerned, was Drunk Uncle Paul, like it was one word. But he was an alcoholic who one Christmas had to be persuaded not to drive while hammered. And he was a mean drunk.
Yes. I had a neighbor when I lived in a different city. We had like a duplex house thing. And I could hear him punching things and arguing with people when he was that drunk, papers on walls and stuff.
Yeah.
And we shared like a big outside trash can thing, and every week there's like 2 or 3 24 boxes or cases or 12 packs of beer in the thing.
Like, what I'm talking about when I say I don't have a problem with drinking is not alcoholism or even just like heavy college binge drinking, because that's got some real issues to it as well. What I'm talking about is I used to, every year for his stocking, get my partner funny little bottles of alcohol. Like the little mini bar sized ones. I'd get, $20 worth of funny to me alcohol. And he'd drink it slowly over the course of a year. Or people who like a glass of wine with dinner, or people who drink a couple of beers when it's hot out, or stuff like that. I do not have a problem with any of that. I know that a lot of people were drinking a lot more than that.
Yeah. If you ever seen the
Oversimplified,
when they talked about that guy at the beginning, it was like drinking.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence is shown in the musical 1776 as constantly asking where the rum is and asking for more rum. And the thing is, one of the reasons people in the past drank more beer and wine specifically, than people today do, is that you couldn't trust the water. And in order to make beer, you have to boil the water, and wine is, fermented grape juice, so it's not the same. I mean, there's water involved, obviously, but it's not like it's just water from somewhere. So those were safer options. And the wine and beer that would have been consumed in those days would have been usually fairly weak.
And so would the hard liquor be like moonshine then? Something like that?
Well, this is the thing, is by the 19th century, there was major distilling in the United States. You know, some of the companies that are still big names today go back well before Prohibition. So let's look at Jack Daniels, for example. No, I don't want to buy Jack Daniels. I want information about Jack Daniels. Should have just searched Wikipedia. You know, there are some names that if you search them, all you get is options to buy them.
And now you'll get like next 3 months alcohol coupons in the mail.
For real though. Yeah, the Jack Daniels distillery goes back to 1875. And that was not moonshine, that was a legitimate, you know, distillery. Because those did exist in the United States fairly early in our history. There was also moonshine, but there was commercial spirit production in the United States going back, you know, to the colonial era. Part of the triangle trade, which wasn't a pure triangle and, you know, it's a whole thing, but was rum, which was produced using the sugar cane from the Indies. There's a song in 1776, the most powerful song in the entire show is called Molasses to Rum to Slaves. Because they didn't know what else to do with the molasses after they'd produced the sugar cane, so they made it into alcohol. And it was a huge product. So humans basically went from drinking low alcohol wine and beer as what you drank all the time to, hey, there's suddenly really easy availability of highly distilled spirits. And people kind of went nuts. And there were a lot of people who were still just drinking, you know, some wine, some beer. But there were also a lot of people who were getting very, very drunk. And there were people who were thereby not supporting their family. That's where the temperance movement really gets its start, is concern about the societal damage being caused by alcohol.
Yeah, no, and we'll get into this in the next amendment too, but I think with a lot of people, weren't the people proposing, not protesting, what's the word, starts with a P, cheering out, promoting this amendment, also the people that are promoting the next amendment too?
Yeah. Well, you know, there's a lot of overlap in the 19th century as far as socially and politically active women. The abolition movement, the suffrage movement, and the temperance movement had enormous amounts of overlap. There was an organization called the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and they were a huge thing in these days. And there was, you know, the first women's, and we'll get to this in the next one, but the first women's rights convention was held in the 1840s. And they were persuaded to let it go in favor of abolition and getting black men the vote. But once, you know, the previous amendments had passed, these women are like, okay, well, what are we going to do with our political force now that we've gotten abolition passed and that we've gotten black men the vote? Where are we focusing now? And the two places that we're really focused on were suffrage and temperance. And the thing is temperance is a misnomer for a lot of the people in the movement, because temperance is more moderation. I have no problem with temperance as moderation. If you want to drink now and again, enjoy. If you are getting hammered day in and day out and you're not taking responsibility for the things you have responsibility for, that's a bigger problem. And there were predatory movements within the alcohol, distribution community where, yeah, they were deliberately selling more alcohol to people than just a couple of beers. The free lunch in the saloon was deliberately very, very salty so that you would drink more. And there were a lot of women and children being abused by violent drunks. I don't want to downplay any of the real problems that existed leading up to the 18th Amendment. Especially when you remember that at the time, good married women, and for the purposes of this discussion, poor women don't count, but good married women didn't work. So if your husband was an abusive drunk who didn't pay the bills because he was, off getting drunk instead and couldn't hold a job, and when he did have money was spending it all, drinking and gambling with his friends, what were you going to do? You would suffer and your children would suffer, and there was nothing you could do about it. And it is very, very easy to see alcohol as a cause of this problem. So I understand the feelings that the women in the temperance movement had. And there were some people who started to believe that the Bible was opposed to drinking, which, spoiler, it is not. The first miracle Jesus performs is turning water into wine. And there are people who will try to convince you that it is unfermented grape juice, and they are wrong. Because the story explicitly says that the guests are getting drunk. So, but it's really easy to see, this is an attempt to create social change for the better of women and children in a time where women didn't have a lot of control over their own lives. And a lot of the men who voted for it assumed that, a lot of them assumed there would only be a problem for those people and didn't realize that it turns out champagne is an intoxicating liquor that you're now no longer allowed to import into the United States, for example.
Like, whoopsie.
Yeah. A lot of supporters of this amendment were taken by surprise when it actually passed, and they saw how strict it was. So,
like
this is passed exclusively by men.
And this is also, I think, a lot of the men that would have I think you're talking about a lot of the men that would have opposed this was also think of World War I at the time.
Yeah. It's not a coincidence that this passed in the middle of World War I. Because while vote by mail for soldiers was a thing that had existed starting the Civil War, it's also true that if you're in the trenches, you're less concerned about what's happening with your congressman. There are a lot of factors that go into the ratification of the 18th Amendment. And it makes historical sense that the movement existed and that the amendment passed when it did. Almost immediately, people started finding ways to get around it. Because it's impossible to prevent the manufacture of intoxicating liquors.
Yeah, I think you mentioned when we did this the last time about some kind of grape juice rules they had.
Yeah, you could buy these bricks essentially of concentrated grape juice. They were shelf stable, and there were instructions on them that told you how to not store them. Because if you stored them that way, it would turn into wine. And apparently there were entire neighborhoods that smelled of fermenting grape juice. And it saved the California grape industry, which, let's be clear, is huge. There are parts of Central California that produce enormous amounts of grapes and enormous amounts of hops.
Yeah, I think well, I heard, we said, I don't know if it's true or not, but the two big competitors were California and France, or maybe Italy.
Yeah, California at the time that this passed, the highbrow wine was French, but California already had a really strong wine industry. And in recent years, it's been fully acknowledged that California wines, the best California wines and the best French wines, are equivalent. As established, I don't know how you go about saying what a best wine is, because but
I've only
in
had
wine, huh?
so I've only ever had wine twice. Once at my niece's this wedding gay place. But they're told this between white and red. I don't know what the difference is.
So you can make. So there are white grapes that will produce white wine, but you can also make white wine out of some red grapes if you remove the peels.
Okay.
Before juicing.
Yeah, the wine thing never. I don't know. I never understand the rules. Like, you drink white wine with this meal, but you drink red wine with this meal, and you.
Yeah, no, and wine speak is ridiculous and overblown, and one of those things that I'm never going to forget is that my best friend and I were once at. We went and had lunch at this really upscale feeling restaurant in downtown Olympia. It wasn't actually all that upscale, but it had that like high class feel. And they had a wine list, and it had descriptions of all of the wines. And the one that she got because the description of it said that it had notes of winter wind. And we just found that enormously funny. And a lot of wine speak is nonsense, and studies prove that it's nonsense. It's a whole thing. But it is true that, I've been through wine country in California multiple times. The last time I went to California, we stopped at the Coppola Winery because one of the people in the car, that was their payment for being willing to go along and help pay for gas, was that we had to stop at a winery. And the Coppola one had a film museum, so I've been in the presence of Oscars because of that trip. But it is a huge, huge industry, and was at this time. This is the thing, is a lot of people were in those days employed in some way by the alcohol industry. They worked for a winery, they worked for a vineyard, they worked for, hops farm, they worked in a brewery, they worked in a bar. There's this enormous number of ways you can work. You make bottles for a living. Well, most of the bottles were going to be going for wine or beer or hard liquor. God only knows how many people were employed in some way by the alcohol industry in the United States. And this is a huge, huge problem. And I have to tell you, I can make alcohol out of the ingredients I have in my house right now. Because I would not be that hard pressed to find a recipe for mead, and I have honey. It's not difficult to make alcohol. You cannot prohibit making alcohol because people do it all the time by accident. I was at a party in college where it turned out that the orange juice concentrate had been sitting around for long enough to ferment.
So, question: should we wait until the 21st to decide when they realize this was a big mistake? Or
I think that's the background that we need for that.
Okay.
I'm just saying this is doomed to fail. because one of the things in it you literally cannot prevent. And of course, importation there gets into smuggling and all of these things. But we're going to go to the next slide.
Yeah.
The Congress and the several states shall have concurrent power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation.
Now, there's a question there. They had they had the power to enforce. Does it mean they did enforce it?
Well, yeah. The problem is, one of the problems, there were so many problems with prohibition, I can't even begin to start listing. But one of the problems with this amendment is that the people who wanted prohibition were also big proponents of small government. And you have this enormous, impossible to enforce thing that you have established that the government's going to be in charge of, run by people who don't want to pay for enforcing it. You know, somebody I know recently said that I forget what system they were saying. Oh, it was the anti-marijuana sprung out of the enormous numbers of prohibition agents who got laid off because they had to have something to do with them. It's like, there was never enormous numbers of prohibition agents. Like, I don't think you realize how few prohibition agents there were.
And of course, this is a hypothesis here, or guess, but unlike when the Congress, whenever it passed anti-marijuana bills, like here, these congressmen maybe are, but I bet these congressmen were still drinking.
Oh, good Lord, yes. Oh, yeah. No, there was a guy who was known as the bootlegger to Congress. You know, and specifically, if we look at the previous slide, it doesn't say you can't own alcohol. And it doesn't say you can't consume the alcohol you already own. So if you laid up a good wine cellar, well, the law couldn't touch you for drinking what you already had, so long as you didn't sell it or transport it. The people in power were never affected by prohibition. Like, they kept on drinking. Frankly, most of the country kept on drinking. Drinking dropped briefly and then went way up. And it couldn't, there was not the money needed to even pretend to enforce it.
Now, is this true where this is where the FBI gets start at?
Yeah. The FBI has its roots in prohibition. And that is the closest we have to enforcing this article by appropriate legislation. There were some prohibition agents, and some local jurisdictions took it more seriously than others. And actually, Al Capone's brother was a prohibition agent, because irony has always been dead. But clearly the wording of this amendment is, yeah, we'll figure out how to do that. So what got passed was what's called the Volstead Act, which was, okay, here's how we're actually going to do all of this.
Yeah, like we mentioned, I think in the Simpsons Schoolhouse Rock parody, once you pass it, you can pass all sort of crazy laws.
Right. The Volstead Act called intoxicating beverages anything greater than 0.5% alcohol, which is not much at all. There are foodstuffs that have higher alcohol content than that?
What's the legal, like, if they pull you over drunk and you're intoxicated for drinking and driving?
It varies by jurisdiction. In Washington, it's 0.08% blood alcohol.
So this was even less than that.
Well, but this isn't how drunk you can be. This is what percentage of the beverage can be alcohol.
Okay.
And hold on a second. The alcohol content of sauerkraut is generally about 0.2%. So you could get sauerkraut that would be 0.051% alcohol, and therefore illegal under the Volstead Act. So, yeah. And it's also true that physicians could prescribe alcohol to their patients. It was limited how much they could, but they could. And pastors, priests, ministers, rabbis, and others who practiced religious actions could get a permit to provide alcohol for sacramental purposes. And, of course, alcohol for industrial purposes was legal, which, don't get me wrong, alcohol has a lot of industrial purposes. Alcohol is a very useful chemical. But there were so many loopholes, and people found so many of those loopholes. Technically, I am covered under clergy. I have my certificate from the Universal Life Church. I can legally perform weddings, which means that I could have handed out, assuming that the Universal Life Church existed and that they would have accepted my ordination under it. But, technically, I am allowed to give out alcohol for religious purposes. Everybody in the 20s was a rabbi, was the joke. So the Volstead Act had a lot of loopholes. And there weren't enough people to enforce it, even with those loopholes in place. And that was pretty well by design. The people who wanted it didn't want to pay to enforce it, and the people who would have theoretically paid to enforce it didn't want it, so that was just how it was going to be. This article shall be inoperative unless it shall have been ratified as an amendment to the Constitution by the legislatures of the several states as provided in the Constitution within 7 years from the date of the submission hereof to the states by the Congress.
Now, I think I forgot to put this in other amendments. Is this the first time an amendment has had a expiration date?
I believe it is, yeah. And I think this would have been a compromise. I'm not real up on that part of it, but I think this would have been, if we can't get it passed, then we're not going to hold it on the books forever. And these days, it's generally assumed that amendments have expiration dates, though, as we'll get to, clearly not all of them do.
Yeah, this one passed in a little bit over a year.
Yeah. So, thank you, World War I. But it was very much, okay, we're gonna see if we can make this happen. And if we can't, no harm, no foul. But they got it passed, and we will get to the harm it caused when we get to repeal, because you need the background to understand why it got repealed, and why it got repealed fairly quickly.
Next week, when we meet again, we'll talk about an amendment I think you might like.
I'm a fan of the next amendment, yes.